Here's an entry-level lower day A that you can use as a high-frequency split. The split will be structured vaguely in order of susceptibility to muscle damage with lower voluntary activation muscles placed first, but I highly recommend that you reorder the split to fit your specific needs, whether that be for enjoyment, goals, or personal restrictions. This is also not my split or how I train personally. Starting off with one of by far the most damage-resistant muscles in the body, the first exercise will be calf raises. The calves are best trained with a partial range of motion, focusing more on the length and position where the gastroc is predicted to have its best leverages to perform plantar flexion, which is apparent when looking at outcome data where the gastroc grew better from length and partials. To save time on the setup and fatigue, I would recommend doing this one leg at a time, although it is perfectly fine to do it bilaterally. For the quads, I'd recommend doing a squat pattern, but for efficiency, I'd recommend one that doesn't limit the range of hip extension too much so that the glutes can be trained in a lengthened position for maintenance of fascicle length. Any deep squatting movement will grow the glutes and adductors better, but it isn't necessary for quad growth, which was confirmed by this study done very recently that seems to match up very well with EMG data on the quads as well as the Kubo squat study. Next, we'll move on to abductors. The glute medius and glute minimus aren't really grown very well from just hip extension alone, as seen with data on Olympic weightlifters' glutes versus the glutes of people that don't lift. This movement seems to be heavily neglected in most upper-lower splits and is important for maximizing glute gains, although I can see how some people may not care so much about the glute medius or glute minimus, so leaving these out will be perfectly fine, but I still highly recommend doing them. Onto the hamstrings. Since we already performed hip extension, we will be focusing on the knee flexion function of the hamstrings, which will train the more distal region since we were working from the knee joint. An isolated knee flexion movement is going to be necessary as the biceps femoris short head isn't trained with pure hip extension, although it would probably not be necessary to hit the biceps femoris with higher frequencies due to its size, and we don't want to sacrifice proximal growth. For the last movement, I highly doubt that any of you would have expected this, but we're going to be doing a hip flexors raise. Now, understandably, seeming that the hip flexors are barely visible, this movement is optional, but the largest hip flexor, this one I can't pronounce it, is a relatively large muscle that can at least contribute to athletic performance and preservation of your health. This muscle is also predominantly type 2 fiber, even with genetic variation, so even with its larger muscle size, it probably doesn't need significantly higher frequencies. The hip flexors raise also allows for some adductor longus and brevis involvement, as it does have a thigh flexion component, but this is a secondary function. You can also argue in the comments whether or not this trains the rec fem. I personally don't think it trains it very well, but that doesn't matter. And this is what lower day A will look like in full.